The camp stretched endlessly under the pale gray sky, and the ground was cold and hard beneath the thin soles of the women's shoes. They moved slowly, as if every step cost a lifetime of strength, their bodies shivering not only from the morning chill, but from the lingering memory of the nights before, when hunger had pressed its sharp teeth against their ribs, and the guards had walked among them with eyes like knives piercing their spirits. One by one, they lined up, their hands clasped. In front of them, hearts beating like drums of warning. Yet no one spoke aloud for fear that a single sound might draw attention and invite punishment. They looked at each other, searching for strength in the pale faces and hollow eyes that reflected the same terror that lived in their own. The sky seemed to press down on the camp, and the barracks were shadows of what they had once been, wooden planks warped and broken with gaps that let the wind slice through them like invisible blades. The women remembered the faces of those who had already been taken away, or worse, those who had tried to resist and had disappeared into silence, leaving nothing but a shiver of warning in the air. The smoke from the distant fires curled lazily toward them and carried the acrid smell of burning wood, and perhaps worse, the faint memory of something lost forever as they waited for the guards to appear. Their thoughts ran like water in a storm. Some remembered their families in distant towns, mothers, fathers, children, siblings' faces that could no longer be touched, and they clenched their teeth to hold back the sorrow. Some remembered small joys, a song hummed under a thin blanket, a shared laugh that felt forbidden now, and others remembered the way the wind had felt against their faces on the rare mornings when the sun had broken through the gray clouds and kissed their cheeks like a promise that life existed outside these walls. Each woman carried a private rebellion tucked close to her chest, a secret act of courage that she dared not speak aloud, yet that gave her the faintest glimmer of hope. They shifted their weight from foot to foot and felt the uneven stones cut into their souls, and even that pain was preferable to the weight of despair that pressed on their chests in the distance. The guards appeared like shadows at the edge of the camp, their boots pounding the earth with rhythm and authority that demanded attention and obedience. The women straightened and held themselves rigidly as the soldiers came closer, and the sound of their voices barked through the air, ordering them to drop the little they held close to them. Their clothing, their meager blankets, their few belongings. The women obeyed outwardly, yet inwardly they made silent oaths that no one would claim their dignity. Their bodies, their last defenses against the emptiness that threatened to consume them. They remembered what it meant to be human, to own a piece of themselves, even in the face of unrelenting cruelty, and they clung to that memory as if it were a lifeline. When the soldiers reached the pile of confiscated items, the flames leapt up hungrily, as if eager to devour the fragile remains of a life that had been stripped. Down to the bones, the women stood in a line, their eyes on the fire and on each other, silently communicating understanding, courage, defiance. Even though the air was thick with smoke and the heat pressed against their skin, they did not flinch, they did not cry out. They let the fire rise higher and higher, as if feeding on the anger and the sorrow that had been building for months. The barracks behind them groaned under the weight of the wind and the cold, and the women felt the ground beneath them tremble not with the earth, but with the collective heartbeat of those who refused to be broken. The sky above darkened as if mourning the innocence that had been taken, and yet the women remained standing tall, their heads held high, their spirits unbowed, even as the flames consumed what little protection they had. Left the memory of home lingered in their minds as a sharp blade cutting through the fear. They remembered gardens where children had played, the smell of cooking rice, the laughter of neighbors, and the soft caress of a mother's hand, and each memory strengthened them. Each recollection of life beyond the camp was a shield against the humiliation being demanded of them. They closed their eyes briefly and breathed in the acrid, air letting the smoke mingle with the scent of soil and sweat, and in that instant they felt a strange kind of power, the power of solidarity, of shared suffering, of women standing together against forces that sought to diminish them. The guards shouted and gestured, but their words became background noise because the women had entered a quiet place inside themselves. A place where neither fear nor hunger nor brutality could reach, a place where they remembered that their essence was theirs, alone, and no one could take it without consent. The fire consumed their last garments, and the crackle of burning fabric became a rhythm they felt in their bones, and as each piece disappeared into ash, they felt a strange liberation, a freedom of spirit that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Their eyes met across the line, and in those gazes promises were exchanged. Promises of endurance. Promises of silence. Promises that they would survive this horror together, even if it meant giving everything they owned except for their courage. The wind blew harder and carried with it a mixture of smoke dust and the faintest hint of flowers from a distant field, and the women inhaled deeply, as if drinking from memory itself. Each inhalation, a reminder that the world existed beyond the barbed wire, that they were not entirely imprisoned. Even as the soldiers barked commands and the sky continued to darken and shift above them, the women began to move slowly back to the barracks, their steps careful, measured, controlled. They did not stumble. They did not show weakness, their bodies tired, their spirits weary yet unbroken. And as they entered the shadows of the wooden structure, they felt the faint warmth of each other's presence, a comfort in a place designed to crush it, and in that dim light they exchanged brief glances and subtle nods, messages of survival without words, because the spoken word could be taken from them, but the unspoken language of shared defiance was untouchable and indestructible. The barracks were filled with shadows and the faint smell of smoke. The women settled onto the hard wooden floors, their minds still echoing with the sound of flames and the memory of their small act of rebellion. The world outside continued in its relentless cruelty. But here, in this corner, they created a small sanctuary, a place where courage lived, where dignity survived, and where the story of their resistance began, even though no one else could see it. They knew that something essential had been preserved, something that could not be burned or broken or stolen, and that thought carried them through the long hours of the day and into the night, where dreams of freedom mingled with the sound of distant guards, footsteps, and the faint whisper of hope, that even in this dark world they would remain unvanquished. The women gathered in the dim shadows of the barracks, their bodies pressed close together, seeking warmth, seeking comfort in the presence of each other. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear, but also something unspoken, something that pulsed between them like a secret heartbeat. They had survived the first wave of humiliation, but they knew more was coming. They knew that the soldiers would demand obedience again, and that their bodies and their spirits would be tested in ways that went beyond hunger and cold. Their eyes met across the crowded floor, each glance a silent conversation, a warning, a plan, a reassurance that they were not alone, that whatever came next they would face it together, and yet beneath the surface of their collective courage ran a torrent of anxiety, of dread, of memories that threatened to overwhelm them, memories of other women who had tried to resist and had vanished into the night, leaving only whispers behind. They could hear those whispers now in the back of their minds, warning them, urging them to stay silent, to obey, to survive. But the women had learned to listen, not only to fear, but to the deeper voice that spoke from the place inside themselves where courage was born, a voice that told them that even in the face of cruelty, they could still claim a small piece of themselves, a secret victory, a final act, that no one could take away. The soldiers returned to the camp, their boots striking the earth like drums of authority. The women lined up once again, each one taking a deep breath and closing her eyes for a brief instant, drawing strength from the rhythm of their shared heartbeat. The commands came sharp and clear. Drop everything, you cannot keep anything hold, nothing close to you. The women obeyed in outward form, their hands emptying their meager possessions onto the dirt floor, but inwardly. They moved with purpose. They had spoken in whispers the night before, they had shared small signals, nods, glances, hints of what would come. Next, a quiet rebellion that no one could see. And so when the soldiers began to examine the pile they found, nothing that could harm them, nothing that could give them control over the women, nothing that could shatter the secret dignity that had been preserved through countless days and nights of suffering, the soldiers grew impatient, their voices rising, and their faces twisting with frustration. The women felt the tension like a physical force pressing against their chests, but they did not waver. They stood as still as statues, their eyes fixed forward, their minds moving through the plan they had, formed in hushed whispers at the edge of sleep, the plan that would allow them to protect what was most precious, the parts of themselves that no one could touch, their bodies, their spirit, their quiet defiance. The first woman stepped forward. She moved slowly, deliberately casting the last piece of her undergarment into the fire. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes were steady, and as the flames licked at the fabric, she felt a surge of power, a sense that she was reclaiming something that had been threatened but not yet taken. The next woman followed her example, and then another and another, until the fire consumed the fragile defenses that had protected them from the cold, from shame, from fear, and yet with each sacrifice, the women felt a strange liberation, a sensation that they were asserting ownership of themselves in a world that had tried to take everything from them. The soldiers shouted and gestured, their voices harsh and angry, but the women did not hear them. Not really, their focus was on each other, on the line of strength that had formed, and the rhythm of their silent rebellion. The smoke rose thick and black, curling into the gray sky, carrying with it fragments of dignity, fragments of courage that refused to die in the face of oppression, and as the fire crackled and consumed the final pieces of clothing, the women exchanged glances, brief, fleeting moments of connection that said more than words ever could. A silent agreement that they would endure, that they would survive, that they would not allow the cruelty around them to define their worth. The barracks shook under the weight of the wind and the occasional stomp of a guard outside, but inside the women felt an unspoken bond, a connection that was stronger than fear, stronger than hunger, stronger than the oppressive power that sought to crush them. They moved back to the shadows, carefully measured steps, their bodies aching from days without proper food or rest, but their spirits alive with the small victory they had claimed. Their minds raced through memories of home, memories of laughter, of gardens, of rivers, of familiar streets and faces they had loved and lost, and they drew strength from those recollections, imagining the warmth of sun on their skin, the soft murmur of family voices, the quiet peace of nights unbroken by fear, and each memory became a shield, each recollection a weapon in the fight to maintain control over what was theirs. No matter how much the outside world demanded compliance, they whispered among themselves in hushed tones when no one could hear, devising signals, gestures, words that would carry meaning without being detected, teaching each other small tricks of survival, how to endure a hunger, how to remain alert, how to move without being noticed, how to convey courage without inviting retribution. And in those moments, the barracks became a school of resilience, a sanctuary of learning, a place where the women were both teacher and student, both protector and protected. They spoke of courage, not in grandiose terms, but in practical small actions, each one a thread in the fabric of their collective strength. They shared memories of defiance, small victories that had kept despair at bay, and slowly they realized that together they were more than the sum of their fear, more than the sum of the abuse, more than the sum of the hunger and cold that pressed in from all sides. And when the guards, shouted again when their voices rang like thunder, demanding obedience. The women did not flinch. They held themselves upright, their eyes forward, their minds on the quiet plan that had been set in motion in whispers before dawn. The plan that ensured that no matter what the soldiers demanded, they would retain control over what was truly theirs to protect the fire. Smoldered in the distance, the ashes, a testament to the act of courage that had passed like a secret across the line of women, and as they settled back onto the hard wooden floors of the barracks, they felt the lingering warmth of each other's presence, the knowledge that they were not alone, that their shared defiance had created a force greater than the cruelty that surrounded them, that they had claimed a victory so small it was invisible to the guards, so profound it could never be taken away. And as night fell, the women whispered softly to each other, recounting the events of the day. Their words cautious, careful, deliberate, a ritual of remembrance and preparation. Each phrase a reinforcement of their connection, of their courage, of the quiet rebellion that would carry them forward, even as the camp continued its relentless grind against their bodies and spirits. The shadows of the barracks stretched long and dark, but within them, the women found pockets of light, pockets of hope, a knowledge that no matter what came next, they had already survived something terrible, something that could have broken them, and yet had not. They had learned that strength was not only in endurance, but in action, in the reclaiming of even the smallest piece of themselves, and as they drifted toward a restless sleep, their minds remained alert, their hearts intertwined, their resolve sharpened their bodies, weary but unbowed, ready to face whatever the next day would demand, because they had discovered that courage was contagious, that defiance was a language all its own, and that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the human spirit could carve out a space that remained untouchable, and that space belonged to them and them alone. When the command came, they stepped forward, one by one, their eyes fixed on the flames as if looking directly at fear itself, their bodies trembling yet determined, each movement deliberate, controlled, as if every step carried the weight of their dignity and the memory of those who had come before them. They could feel the heat of the fire on their skin, a sharp contrast to the chill that had settled in their bones over months of deprivation. Yet the fire was not an enemy. It was a witness, a consuming force that would take what they chose to give and leave their courage intact. They reached for the last pieces of fabric, the final threads of protection they had clung to with a mix of shame and defiance. The soldiers shouted instructions, threats, warnings, their voices harsh and sharp, but the women moved as if underwater, their senses attuned only to the rhythm of their own hearts and the silent conversation passing through glances and gestures. The first woman let the garment slip from her fingers, watching as it caught in the flames. She inhaled deeply, the acrid smoke filling her lungs, but she did not flinch. She felt a strange sense of liberation, as if every thread that burned carried away a piece of the fear that had nested inside her since the day they arrived in the camp. The next woman followed her example, a tremor running through her hands. But, her gaze steady, she cast the fabric forward, and it vanished in a flash of orange and black smoke, a hiss of fire and ash that seemed to swallow more than the clothing it consumed, the humiliation, the vulnerability, the cold and empty nights. The sound of crackling flames echoed across the camp, a rhythm that matched the beating of hearts that refused to break as each woman acted. She felt the weight of her choices and the power of owning them, for even in surrender there was control, a reclaiming of something intimate and untouchable that no one could take without consent. Their eyes met across the line, brief flickers of recognition, of shared courage and understanding that what they were doing was more than survival. It was a statement, a refusal, a quiet rebellion that would live in memory long after the smoke cleared. The guards barked and gestured, their frustration mounting, their authority challenged by the composure of women they had assumed powerless. The women felt the tension, like a physical presence pressing against them, yet it did not sway them because the bond that had formed between them was stronger than the commands that rang out across the barren camp. The fire rose higher, consuming the garments in a dance of orange and black, and the women felt a strange exhilaration. The act of surrender had transformed into an act of power, a ritual of defiance that no one could witness fully, and yet that filled them with a silent pride, a recognition that even in the darkest circumstances there was space to assert oneself, to declare to the world and to oneself that the body and the spirit could not be entirely taken. The smoke curled into the sky, thick and acrid, carrying fragments of their courage, fragments of dignity that could never be replaced, nor destroyed. Each woman drew a deep breath, the smoke filling her lungs, a bitter taste mingling with the warmth of adrenaline and resolve as the last piece of clothing disappeared into the flames. The women stepped back together, forming a line that seemed unbroken by fear, by shame, by the brutality that surrounded them. Their eyes locked briefly in silent communication, the fire crackling between them, a witness and a shield. And as the guards shouted, "Again!" frustration etched into their faces. The women did not move, did not waver. They had claimed something. No amount of shouting or threats could take away the barracks behind them, groaned under the wind. The creaking wood, a reminder of the harsh environment, yet within the shadows of the structure, the women felt a faint warmth from each other's presence, a quiet comfort in the midst of turmoil. They moved slowly back inside, careful measured steps, their bare feet brushing against the rough wood. The sensation, a reminder of the vulnerability and the strength intertwined in each action as they settled on the floor. The memory of the flames lingered in their minds, the smell of smoke, the heat, the rush of courage mingled with exhaustion, a complex cocktail that left them silent yet profoundly aware of the connection that had been forged in that moment. The night pressed in around them long and heavy, their bodies aching from the months of deprivation, their spirits weary but unbroken. And in that silence, a strange kind of peace settled over them, a recognition that something essential had survived, something that could not be burned or stolen or violated. The women whispered to each,